This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 153 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Today we're combining two of my very favourite things to do, reading and travelling. And today's topic is all about reading books to inspire travel. Now, I have lots and lots of thoughts on this. I'll try and keep them reasonably brief because I have three guests who also have thoughts on this to fit in this episode. But when it comes to reading books and then getting inspiration to travel from them, I find there's all sorts of different ways that I do this. It's certainly not just that I go and read guidebooks, although I still do often grab a guidebook from a library just to get to kind of the gist of things and to see what unusual things I can learn from it. But I love to read any kind of travel narrative book. My classic example is always Paul Theroux's The Great Railway Bazaar. If you haven't read it, it involves a stint on the Trans-Siberian across Russia. And I read it decades ago, and that inspired me to take the Trans-Siberian across Russia. It was something that I'd longed to do for many years after reading that book. I think I read it several times, and eventually, oh goodness, it's now like 16 years ago. Gosh, time flies. I took the Trans-Siberian train from Vladivostok to Moscow, and I loved being able to live what I'd discovered from reading that book. So often it's a travel narrative that makes me, get that kind of travel inspiration. And another kind of non-fiction book that I really love is any memoirs that are set in another land, especially the kind of memoir of someone who moves there. So, I've had several expat experiences myself, and I often find that, someone who's from a similar culture to me moving somewhere else, they often can give me an insight that kind of, I guess it fits together with the kind of insights that I need to have to be able to understand a new country better. I've got two on my shelf, so I pulled them off to think about it while I was preparing for this podcast. And before I went to Iceland, I read a book called Names for the Sea, Strangers in Iceland by Sarah Moss. And so she's a British academic who went to work in Reykjavik in the university there. And I read that just before my trip to Iceland a few years back. And it informed a lot about what I was going to experience there. And similarly, you've already probably heard me rave about the year of living Danishly. If you haven't, I think I talk about it a lot in episode 150, which was my kind of debrief on my trip to Denmark. But The Year of Living Danishly by Helen Russell, the subtitle is Uncovering the Secrets of the World's Happiest Country. And it does exactly that. Helen Russell describes all kinds of things that happened to her while she still is living in Denmark, but in her first year there. She moved there because her husband got a job working for Lego, which is pretty cool. So they were living in rural Denmark. And learned a lot about the Danish culture and described it in this book in just such an interesting and often funny way. And I, learned so much from it that I went off to question people in Denmark all about it. So that's, those kind of memoirs are often like really inspiring for me to learn more about a place I'm going to. And the other thing I really, really love to do is simply to read fiction novels that are just set in the place that I'm either going to or that I want to, maybe know more about, maybe I'll go to. So a shout out to a friend of mine who's a fabulous author that fits this bill, Natasha Lester. So she's written a lot of historical fiction and also some of the settings in modern times as well. In particular, she has several books set in New York and Paris, which, make me want to go back to both of those cities. I'll leave links to all of these books in the show notes so you don't have to remember everything. And, I have a bit of an obsession with Scandinavia at the moment. And of course, the big thing that Scandinavia produces, among many others, are a lot of crime novels. And I'm not certainly not usually a crime novel reader, but something about the Scandinavian ones really intrigues me, and I love the setting. So in the last few months, I read a Norwegian one. It was by, I don't know the good pronunciation. I apologize, everyone who knows more about Norwegian than me, Gunnar Stelsen. And it was a novel called Big Sister set in Bergen, which was just, it's so scenic and reminded me of the Norway I discovered when I was a kid there, and I want to go back to. And also before I went to Denmark, I read a bunch of Danish crime books. One of my favorites was called The Night Ferry by Lotte and Søren Hammer. And it was just so, it's just a typical police novel, but it was in Denmark. There was so much Denmark in the background of that novel. And, you can learn so much from those kind of books as well. I'm going to Cairns next month in Queensland, and I just have a bunch of books on reserve ready to pick up at my local library, which are set in Cairns. Interestingly, I think 2 out of the 4 are also crime novels. So I don't know what it is about crimes being described in places I visit, but I won't read too much into that, hopefully. Anyway, so that's my, sorry, I was trying to be brief. That's my semi-brief version of the kind of books I love to read to inspire my travel. But I'd love you to hear from some of my guests as well. So my first one today is Kendall Simmons, who basically is a woman after my own heart with her thoughts on reading to inspire travel.
I read books a lot. If there's 2 things I'm obsessed with in life, it's reading books and then going travelling. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, a lot of my travelling has been wrapped around visiting places that I've read about in books, but I am very fond of travelling. When I'm travelling, I'm very fond of reading books before I go. So, for instance, the first time I ever went to China, obviously we'd all read things like Wild Swans, and I'd read a biography of Mao Zedong, but that was all, a little bit harrowing. And I thought I needed to know a little bit more about the people who lived in the times. And I came across a book called The Last Empress by Amchi Min, which was about literally the last woman who held the throne before the last emperor. I'm sure we've all seen that movie. So when I went to the Forbidden City, even though, she had lived a very rarefied life, it was still nice to be able to have some idea of what it was like to live in that environment. Now, obviously, my preference runs to fiction, which is not quite the same, but it still gives you an insight, I think, onto how it's valuable.
Oh, I agree. I mean, I have the same preference. I would rather read some novels set in those places. And I think, in many cases, you still get a really good sense of the place as well as the culture and the people and all of that. And then you've got kind of a jumping off point to explore once you get there.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And, and how many of us have visited places because of an attachment to a fictional character, for instance. I know that many of the places mentioned in the Outlander books are remarkably visited on a regular basis, and in the hopes of finding some, handsome Scotsman who will save you from oncoming evildoers. But, so often that's what it is. It just enhances our ability to travel to those places and to see what we can find.
Absolutely. What's your process before you travel? I mean, or how does it work? Does the book come first or the destination? And how do you find books that are set where you're headed?
Well, it's a combination of 2. I have travelled to places that I have fallen in love with through a book, and we can talk about that later. But what I normally do is, say, for instance, I'm going to Wales next year, for example. So obviously I've read several books that are set in Wales, but literally I would just simply Google books set in Wales, because I'm an inveterate researcher. So I would have a look and I would read the reviews, etc., and I would take it from there. So often it's just as simple as choose something that looks interesting.
Yep. That's pretty much my process too, I have to say. And it's amazing how much you can find out there, really, no matter what your destination is, I've found.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So, all hail the internet.
Yes.
Also, recently I'm a member of a book club that reads on a theme rather than reads individual books. And we recently did our theme was books set in different cultures. So obviously we had a variety of books set in Myanmar, which is Burma, and a variety of other places, Scotland, Estonia, all sorts of strange places that you would never think of reading a book on.
Cool.
But, I think if you just, hit the dart on the map and see where you want to go, you'll find a novel about it somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. There are so many, many, many millions of books in the world. Someone has written about everywhere at some stage.
Oh, and there are so many, and there's that great genre where people are looking for a tree change or a sea change or a country change and have, provided their memoirs for us to read.
Yes, absolutely. Memoirs are another good pre-reading strategy, I think. My favourite pre-Denmark book was The Year of Living Danishly.
That's a great book.
It's a fabulous book, and I just took so much from it with me, and it informed so many things I did, and a lot of the conversations I had with locals there. It was just exactly perfect book for me to read before that trip. Kendall reminded me actually that when you are visiting a place, sometimes that's a great opportunity to find books that are probably hard to find elsewhere, the kind of books that have been written and, hopefully also translated, but on sale for tourists and, might not be available elsewhere, but they're, really indicative of that kind of particular setting. I've come across a bunch of those in different places around the world, and they're often a really good read as well, especially if you can read about a place while you're still in it. That's pretty fun. Now, my next guest today is Lesley West, and I am trying to think back. I've known Lesley for quite some years now. She's a Perth person too. I think we originally met because she came to one of my travel writing workshops. I'm not sure. I'll have to get Lesley to correct me on that. But in any case, I know that she is obsessed with both books and traveling. And she's one of those people who is really interesting to follow on Facebook, because I always see the new books she's been reading and gets lots of inspiration for myself. And she's prolific with her reading. I need to know her secret, actually. Anyway, we discussed all kinds of things, book and travel related.
I'm a reader, period. It kind of doesn't matter if it's regarding travel or regarding just my normal life. That's kind of an escape for me. I think it is something that is critical just to expanding your mind and having a greater understanding of the world around you. But when you look at that in a nutshell in relation to travel, it's almost a little crazy to not research and read books before you go, because I think it richens your overall understanding of the place that you're headed. So the literal interpretation of that is the easiest and simplest one, which is go buy the guidebooks, right? Go buy the guidebooks. Just that's going to give you a lay of the land for the place you're going. When it comes to Europe, I am a total disciple of a man called Rick Steves. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
We are familiar with him down here, yes.
Oh, he is a dream man. He has it's several years old now at this point, but he had a television show that was on in the United States about travel. And he has this kind of guidebook empire when it comes to Europe. He is fairly Europe specific. Yeah. But when it comes to guidebooks, Rick Steves is my man. I read everything he writes, and I show up in a location in Europe feeling like, hey, I know the deal. I at least have a general lay of the land. I know what not to miss. He gives these amazing tips on ways to handle local situations and currency and local customs and how to tip in restaurants, just the basics that you're going to want to know when you get there, right?
Exactly.
So anyone who isn't doing that, I would so encourage taking the time. You don't have to read a guidebook cover to cover. If it's 500 pages long, even if you hit the highlights and read the chapters that are just most critical to you, it's worth the time. Even if it's on the plane on the way to where you're going, just refresh your memory and get those little tidbits that are going to help you once you arrive. So that's the practical thing. I strongly encourage people to invest in, even if it's just one really good guidebook for a location. But the even better thing to do, and my favorite thing to do, is to also read books. They may not even be real life. They may be purely fictional, but read books that are set in the place that you're going.
I love doing this.
I love this. It's my favorite. And it took me until probably about, 5 or 6 years ago before I really started digging into this. But it is a game changer. And the perfect example of this, actually have a few examples, but in September, my husband Kane and I were on a month-long trip where we spent a few weeks in the former Yugoslavia. Okay. So we were in Croatia, we were in Bosnia, Slovenia, and also Montenegro, all of which are fascinating. I mean, this is like not too distant past that we're talking about
that's
here.
Right.
You know, the Bosnian War was happening in the early 90s when I was in elementary school.
I was going to say, I was in high school. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean,
I remember it well.
You know, mine is a little more vague because I was a kid and you're probably not paying super, in-depth attention to the news when you're in third grade. But I knew what was going on in Bosnia. And so in addition to the guidebooks and the nitty-gritty details of how to get around in Bosnia, I purchased books to read while in former Yugoslavia that were off of the English language bookshelf in the different local bookshops.
Oh, great idea.
And you'd be amazed, you know what? The topics of those English language bookshop shelves, they're very limited, right? When you go in, you might have 10 or 12 titles to choose from in some of these small towns, but they're almost all focused on local issues or they're fiction based in those places. And the books that I read on that trip, even the fiction ones, further enriched my understanding of the local person's perspective of the war that they lived through. And that's fascinating. You can't get that any other way, right? You can talk to local people who can explain it. You can take these tours of fascinating points, like Mostar in Bosnia, for example, is this beautiful town. It has a stunning bridge across the river, and it was famous during the Bosnian War for this very long siege where the bridge got bombed out. And then later on, several years later, was rebuilt and is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But you can take that tour and you can stand on the bridge and you can soak it in. But until you've read a book that has an account of someone who lived through the siege that happened in that city, I don't know. I don't feel like you have a full understanding of the nitty-gritty details of what that felt like. So reading those books, even though it was maybe not 100% real, like I said, a couple of them were fiction, but they were based on historical fact of what was happening in that country. I feel like I left Bosnia not only because I visited it and saw it with my own eyes, but because of that literature that I read that went hand in hand. I left Bosnia feeling like, okay, I have as far as a 30-something year old American can get into the details of this, I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of maybe what it felt like, the fear and the misunderstandings and the cultural differences that just went head to head that caused this war to explode. I had a much better understanding of that than I ever would have been able to otherwise if I hadn't read the books to back it up.
Sorry, everyone. There I go again, banging on about Denmark and books. And yeah, I need to get a new destination in mind so I can stop raving about Denmark. Or maybe I never will. Well, I'll get new destinations. I just won't stop raving. Anyway, my final guest today is Alistair Humphreys. We started our chat talking about how reading has inspired his travels, but then we also move on to talking about how Alistair, as an author, hopes to inspire other people as well.
Reading books was a big part of my life before travel was a big part of my life. And I used to read books of travel and adventure. And I loved that vicarious thrill of all these crazy far off places and exciting stuff. And gradually I read enough of those books to shake up my momentum so much that I finally got off my backside and put the book down and went to have a look at the world myself. So I owe a debt of gratitude to travel writing and travel writers for sharing their world with me and exciting me enough to go have a look at my own world. So that's a big part of traveling for me. And then I just enjoy seeing places through different eyes. You know, when you travel somewhere, you only see the world as you do. So for me, I'm a white, middle-class, middle-aged white man, and I love reading a similar story. So I cycled across Asia, but if I read the story by, say, Dervla Murphy, who is an Irish woman who cycled to India, it's a similar journey and adventure, but told through totally different eyes. And I find that broadens my perspective on adventure as well.
Yeah, it's like it's an interesting way to kind of travel in a way you actually physically never can, because you can only have your own perspective. So to be able to see someone else's is like repeating a trip, but you can only do it by reading. That's awesome.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And I think reading books led me on to wanting to write books, which led me on to trying to be more observant when I travel. So when I travel, I always write a diary, and I write loads and loads and loads and loads of stuff. And most of that never sees the light of day. And I do it for all little trips. And I actually treasure those sitting on a street writing what I'm seeing much more than taking photographs, which is something I do love as well. So I find that the process of writing helps me get more out of my travel trips as well, even if that writing is not really for publication necessarily.
That's true, because you've written quite a few books about your travels now. Has that writing process, once you're home and writing a book, how does that make you reflect on your travel? Does it have any impact on how you travel next time, or how does that all work out?
I think it's interesting because writing the book often takes longer than the actual trip itself. So you end up replaying the trip more in hindsight than the actual time you were away. And there's good things and bad things to that. I think the good thing, of course, is it, rather than just galloping endlessly on to the next new experience, is it gives you pause to reflect and think and figure out what you might have learnt from that whole adventure. The downside, perhaps, is that you polish your story so much that it starts to, at times, just not dissolve, that's the wrong word. It starts to just turn into a series of slick anecdotes rather than the raw experience you had. And the real hazard of writing a book is by the end of it, you're so sick of the stupid project. You're just desperate for the end of it. You wish you'd never started the thing in the first place. So it definitely can wear a bit thin.
I can imagine, because a book is a very special kind of project, isn't it? It's a lot more time consuming than a podcast episode or a blog post. And I have a bunch of author friends and clients here in Perth, and I know that they can be, well and truly fed up with their story before it's actually hit the bookshops. So. Yeah,
it's a ridiculous thing. For me, it's roughly a book a year. It's roughly my life.
Right.
So I sit down, I spend a year working on this thing, which won't earn me anywhere near as much money as a year of work ought to earn. And I put so much heart and soul into it, and there's so much self-loathing and hatred. And then hardly anyone reads it. Half the people who do read it just skim it while they're sitting on the toilet and put it down. A few people just put on Amazon, "This is rubbish, what a waste of time." And that's a legacy of a year of your life. Meanwhile, you go back 10 years later to look at what you thought was your masterpiece, and you just cringe in horror at your younger self. So I think you might be in the right business being in the podcast game.
I do go back and listen to early episodes of the Thoughtful Travel podcast and cringe a little, but not as badly probably as I would. I think you've summed up the writing life fairly well, I think. But you keep doing it, so there must be enough pleasure in it. And I think that that ability to share a story, especially the kind of things that you've done that a lot of people might not do, I think is really important and really valuable to do.
Well, thank you. I think there's a lot of ego and vanity in writing as well. But so I've written, some of my books have just been, so I've written books about cycling around the world for adults and for kids, and they're just sort of, I went here and this fun thing happened, and people read them and it's just fun adventure stuff. But the kids ones, I hope, are actually useful in that they're trying to show kids that the world is actually a good, kind, interesting, generally safe place to go and explore, which is often at odds with the messages of the media and the endless health and safety they hear. And then I wrote a book about small local adventures called Micro Adventures, which has really surprised me by having an impact on helping people get out and explore locally and close to home with the limited time and money that most of us have. And that is when I think writing starts to become useful, when you're actually trying to orchestrate some sort of change for perhaps just a small niche of people, but to actually reach them and have an impact. That's the sort of writing that feels to me worth the agony,
worth all that pain,
worth some of that pain.
I've got Alistair's book, My Midsummer Morning, ready to read very shortly, because the idea of getting by only through your poor busking skills is just too much of a fascinating premise for me not to read it. And actually, I also have The Boy Who Biked the World, which is one of Alistair's kids' books, on my son's reading pile as well. So looking forward to both of those. Anyway, thank you very much for listening to episode 153 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. If you have some other reading recommendations for me or for other group members, I would love to hear them. My list is long, but, there's always time for more books. Come along to the Facebook group. It's called Thoughtful Travellers, and share them there. I would be very appreciative of them. You can find Thoughtful Travellers just by searching in Facebook, or there's a link in the show notes. And the show notes for this episode are at notaballerina.com/153. Now, something I don't do very often, but I will do a quick yell today, is if you are enjoying listening to the Thoughtful Travel podcast, please help us out by sharing that joy. So there's lots of ways to do that. If you are listening in a podcast app like Apple Podcasts, where you can rate or review us, that would be amazing. I would really appreciate that. If you're listening in Spotify, you can hit follow so that you will always get the newest episode whenever you log on. And in any way you can, if you can just share a link or tell a friend about listening to the Thoughtful Travel podcast, I would be super, super appreciative of it, because our listener numbers are always growing, but I would love them to reach even more people, because it's so much fun. And it's always good to see it reaching all corners of the globe. Now, thank you for that indulgence. Now on to my guest today. Thank you so much to Kendall Simmons. You can find Kendall at kendallsimmons.com. Thank you also to Lesley of the BetterLink Business Consultancy. You can find her at betterlinkgroup.edu.au. And also thank you to Alistair Humphreys. You can find him at alistairhumphreys.com. And I'll leave links in the show notes to some of his books, and also to a bunch of the books that we have mentioned in today's episode. So happy reading, and thank you very much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.